מי שעקב אחרי מרצי המפתח שלנו בשלושת מושבי המליאה, בהחלט רואה את החיבור הזה שעשינו השנה, חיבור שהולך ומתהדק בין מדעי הסביבה למדעי החברה. אנחנו היום במושב האחרון, מושב מליאה שמוקדש למדעי החברה, והזמנו כלכלן נכבד מהבנק העולמי, שעוסק בתחום של שירותי מערכת. אני אציג אותו באנגלית. I'd like to introduce our speaker for this plenary session, Dr. Pאולו נונס. Dr. Nunez is an economist with a solid science policy interface expertise. He holds the position of scientific coordinator and policy expert committee on the World Bank. Dr. Nunez is also a member of the Department of Environment, Agriculture and Forestry, University of Padova, Italy, and the Sino-Australian Research Center for Coastal Management, Canberra, Australia. He is a member of the steering committee of the, I hope I'm reading this right, Gulbenkian Oceans Initiative, advisor to the Portuguese Ministry of Agriculture and the Sea, and involved in the Global Partnership for Oceans in the World Bank. Dr. Nunez' research interests focus on combining the use of economic thinking in addressing policy questions and interest in evaluating and accounting for ecosystem services and natural capital. He has written over 200 scientific publications in the fields of environmental economics and policy in a variety of international journals and peer review conferences. He has published 4 books, the latest of which is the Handbook on Ecosystem Economics of Ecosystem Services and Biodiversity from June 2014. He has worked on issues of expertise in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Caribbean, and contributed to a wide set of high-level international initiatives, including the UN Conference on SIDS and the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity under the formal appointment of the European Commission and Ocean Health Index. Dr. Nunez has worked with corporate and third sector organizations in international platforms led by World Business Councils for Sustainable Development, IUCN, BCR, and the Prince Albert II Foundation. Dr. Nunez, benvenuti a Israel. Thank you very much for coming here to share with us. Please.
Shalom. Thank you so much for the kind invitation to be here with you today with this distinguished guest and platform. I'm very happy and honored to be here today. And I was asked to talk about economic valuation or economics in general, ecosystem service, but with a spin on policy and the society in general. So I will follow very closely to the introduction of the 2 distinguished professors, Professor Aram Fitzon and Professor Danny Rubenstein, and I'll try to highlight a bit in more detail some points. So the idea is I have an outline. Many things are on fire, and as I try to give a spin of it, Italian spin in terms of the discussion, and I prepared a sort of a menu with you, starting with antipasto, which is one of the parts I like the most, but I understood now that we have some problems with time, but maybe I will skip the antipasto. And the antipasto, basically, I was talking about economic value, which is very, very, very important to understand exactly what you mean by economic value and about monetary values of the environment, ecosystem services. Then I will think about talking about the primo piatto, so the pasta, which is also very nice. And there I'd like to bring with you the idea about economics and in the environment and economics and ecosystem services and why, on average, we're not so much happy with what we see. Because, in fact, what economists say in their jargon, there is a sort of a market failure. So we have to identify, recognize that market failure, and work around it. And finally, the secondo piatto can be meat or fish. I'll try to discuss with you the mainstreaming into economic policy. And then together we do the dolce, or the dessert is the discussion. But for the sake of presentation, since I would like to discuss things with you, I will skip the the antipasto, if you allow me, because I want to go into the bulk of the conversation. But I will be recapping what I want to say in the antipasto. So the antipasto, what I want to say very briefly, and how to do it in a nutshell, is that economic valuation follows some important principles of consumer theory and producer theory. And wherever you do some valuation exercise, sooner or later you should relate those values to the existing markets. And therefore, the economists should be, let's say, comfortable in explaining and advising the policy making, pursuing one direction or another direction. So the idea is that the values don't come out of the blue, but there's a solid theoretical background. This is basically the zipped version of the antipasto. I will leave the overheads, the PPTs with the organization, and my email is always available for any kind of clarifications. The point is now, having said that, we'll talk about the economics and the environment, okay? One thing is that sometimes you are not seeing the whole picture. The markets are not seeing the whole picture, and some people are left out, okay? And it can be left out completely, or there's something going on in the markets, but it's not exactly capturing the thing. So, for example, in this particular case, it has to do with genetic modified products, and you have some things not going on. So the markets are not exactly capturing some dimensions of it. In this particular case, we can model, or we can look into this feedback and interaction between the environmental systems, economic systems, as giving and receiving. On one hand, we have many benefits from the environment, as listed in the PowerPoint, and as at the same time, the environment is also giving very many services in terms of dealing with activities from the economy. And most of these flows, the complex flows, are not fully mapped in existing markets. So we need to understand, on one hand, the complexity of the relationships, but at the same time do not get freaking out about the degree of complexity, but starting to tackle these things in more detailed, quantitative way. And the ecosystem service approach is one way of doing that. But what is important here is to understand, is one point, that environment and ecosystem service interact with the human well-being, and we're trying to understand the benefits or the impacts between these two systems. So there's an anthropocentric view approach. The environment is filtered and rationalized in terms of its relationships with society. And as this is very, for all of us, well known, on average, you have 3 blocks of ecosystem services, ranging from provisioning, regulating cultural ecosystem services. And this typography or this architecture needs to be then applied in detail to the system you're looking into more detail and highlighting which ones are more important. You don't have to come with a whole list, because then we'll talk with the policymaker, the ideas about prioritization. And fundamentally, you have on the back of your mind these supporting systems, which is the basis of everything to work out. So don't have problems with loss of resilience or flipping the system from one moment to another. And the economist is not exactly trying to do rocket science here. The idea is to understand how these issues of ecosystem service and natural capital is interacting with other forms of capital, including human capital, like labor and built capital, machinery, and land. And economics has been developed are very much around those input factors, and natural capital was surrounding there. So we'll try to bring to that dimension to the equation, and not doing so much modifications in terms of economic modeling, but just highlighting this additional dimension and how this additional dimension is working with existing dimensions. And ecosystem service are the benefits, and again, in terms of the different impacts on human livelihoods. What is interesting here is this quantitative-based framework, and this quantitative-based framework is a multidisciplinary exercise. So you need to understand the system, the functions of the system, the resilience of the system, how those systems are mapped in terms of their productivities, and I'm already using economic terms, And these are metrics to do that, which are in the field and realm of natural scientists. And these metrics, these measurements interact with consumers, interact with producers, with sectors, with tourism, with agriculture, with fisheries, with energy, with extraction, with urban planning, and whatsoever. And they have different metrics. And what economists try to understand is to plan a scenario, and this is already linking to policy, because we're not doing this in universities alone. So the idea, the ultimate goal is to help and to advise, not to advise, to inform the policymaker, so he understands or she understands more clearly what's going on in terms of the scenario. This scenario will be impacted in changes in maps and trade-offs among the ecosystem services, and this is biophysical trade-offs, which are fundamental, and also change in maps and trade-offs in economic terms. And not only in terms of the size of the pie, how much is the impact in terms positive or negative, but more importantly, I also like very much to talk from a translation from the colleague from the Porter School, is about who wins about the distribution parts of the distribution dimension of the impacts. And this has to do with sociological dimensions and how those things can be brought into the equation. And I put here a footnote. With IPCC and climate change scenarios, some people argue, well, basically you're looking at various, some people argue that the overall impacts are very small and we should not be worrying so much about it, just business as usual, more or less about the same. But even if you look into that scenario and that kind of reading, you see exactly the persons who are going to be impacted the most. And the persons who will be impacted the most are the persons or the economies or the constituencies that are more vulnerable to climate change. So we have also to understand exactly who is bearing the costs and who is supporting and who is having the benefits. There's a huge portfolio of techniques to do that. It's not here the place to talk about it. It's just the idea is there is different tools the economists have to perform these kind of evaluations to bring these values, to bring this dimension, to bring this color into the palette of colors and talk to the policymakers. And this was the connection between the primo piatto and antipasto, that all these valuations ultimately need to be reflected in the producer and supply functions or market supply, on the consumers and supply and the demand function, and also very importantly, the governance, how the demand and supply interact. And this is basically the definition that we have in terms of the ecosystem services. You have a system, we have a demand and supply function, and there is a scenario. This scenario is associated with a delta in the provision of the ecosystem services, and ultimately that delta change in the ecosystem service either affects the supply curve. For example, you have a more efficient agriculture system where, for example, you have bunches of pollination among fields. So going back to the discussion of the first keynote speaker, you leave batches of untreated land or just bushes so that the bees can go one place to another. So they have a delta in terms of productivity or in terms of demand function. So there is some issues from the consumer's viewpoint where ecosystems are important, and this alters the shift, the demand of consumers. There are some illustrations I want to say to you in terms that this is not done in let's say, simulations way, or there are some empirical numbers. This is an exercise from 2011, published in Environmental Resource Economics. And what to do here is we try to see climate change impacts on European forests, and then we try to expand to other forests worldwide. And the idea is try to see the mitigation effect that forests may have as an ecosystem service-based adaptation to climate change. I'm not going to the paper, but just going to give you the flavor. You can always read it and listen. You have the sector performance. It can be GDP. You can think something for which you are interested, and you read this performance across time. And you take into account, for example, the climate change and how this performance is being impacted. And then you try to disentangle from that performance the contribution from ecosystem services. And the idea is that in the context of climate change, that performance can be even influences more or less depending what you're looking at, but the ecosystem service have an important role in moving in one direction or another. It can be like a buffer zone, you know. And this needs to be captured. And when it is captured, you have a rationale for investing in this kind of systems. For example, the RED and RED Plus regimes in payment for ecosystem services follow this kind of rationale. There's also something done with a colleague here in Israel. We are doing the same kind of reasoning, but we did for the Mediterranean and for agriculture and productivity of agriculture in the regime of climate change and how biodiversity induced impacts infect with it. We can also do things more à la carte. For example, with another colleague here in Israel, we were working on ecological economics, a paper on tourism flows, on recreation benefits, and we tried to map the dimension of ecosystem service using GIS along the coastline of the world. And this has been done very efficiently by natural scientists. But for economists, this is something still going on in terms of using maps and using visualization maps to give information of ecosystem services. The two exercises are completely different, but the point is to give an idea how this dimension can be brought into discussion. And this is a fundamental fundamental tool, grazie, thank you, for communicating to the policymakers. We have something done in more detail. For example, when you want to look for vulnerable populations and your interlocutor wants to take into account economic information and others, so you can have a sort of a map, and you have different dimensions, GDP, which is something that people like a lot. You have something more biodiversity index. There is something in between, ecosystem service per capita, and this has to do with forests for the Europe. And you have a bit of palette and shades and see exactly where you are. It allows to understand how, for a certain area, the composition within this portfolio of assets is distributed for each individual cell. And then you can do in more detail in terms of trade-offs for certain regions. So the idea is, in a nutshell, economics and economic valuation of customer service is being produced in this information and is bringing this information target in the context of multidisciplinarity within natural science, but with a scope for policy. So the point is the exercise needs to fit policy, and policy makers need to be with you from moment -1. This is a book. But then it's also to make jokes on ourselves. So this is a joke that we do a lot. We have a lot in the bank when you go to these places. Like, and yesterday we were talking about in the panel, if you do species-oriented management schemes or protection conservation management schemes or ecosystem management schemes, this is basically saying, okay, you go there and say some animals are sacked because they're not contributing to the ecosystem service or to well-being, and some animals are not sacked like these guys who do all the contributing to the supporting services. So we have to be careful also in a sense. Economic valuation is important, but you have to also take it with a pinch of salt. So not everything needs to be taken into account in the context of different metrics, and economics is one metric. So you have to be also very critical with yourself. The second one has to do with distribution effects, and this is really a very important issue now. Just being 2 weeks ago at FIO in Rome, and the idea is to all these energy policies on palm oil, and the competition that palm oil does for land, and crowding out valuable land that will be using for support of local communities. So you have also to take into account the distributional impacts of the story. So it's not only maximizing the efficiency of the system, but also to take into account where and whom is being impacted. So the secondo piatto, and I think I'm on time. I'm fine, thank you. Has to do with mainstreaming into economic policy. And I copy-paste this from our program. And I think it fits like a glove. Because sooner or later, first you are in university is meant basically for research, for discussion ideas, mainstreaming ideas, and getting the best out of what we can do in terms of intellectual know-how. At certain moment, you say, okay, you can do something for society, and you're in conditions to do that, but you have to do trade-offs because you're not any longer at an academic environment. You are in an academic environment as an individual, as an expert, but you are asked to do certain tasks. Yeah. You are willing or not willing to participate in the process, it's your call, but once you're doing, you are in a different setting with a different head. But now the idea is that this you're not there anymore on some sporadic basis, but you do something more to bring this as mainstream. Now, what can we do? And history has been telling us, and I also agree with the colleague that has been before me, that the winds and the style alignment is nice. So we started with the Convention on Biological Diversity 20 years ago in Rio de Janeiro, 92, and then you have this DMIA, was a massive work on bringing together the different components and different perspectives in terms of studying these relationships between ecosystems and human welfare. And more recently, with the European Commission, then UNEP, this TIB, and the presentation of the report in COP10 in Nagoya. And the idea is, more and more, there is a good understanding about the contribution of ecosystem services for human well-being. This was copied just after the publication of TIB. But what I want to say to you is not about this so old, though, is that a journal like The Economist, where the environment is not their cup of tea, so they are more interesting to do other things, they start to give focus on these issues. See, this was 2008. And today, more and more, let's say, the star alignment is positive. So there is great acceptability of economics of ecosystem services, on economics of ecosystem services. I apologize for the typo. There's also the embracement of policies like PES, Payment for Ecosystem Service, changing dynamics of biodiversity in ecosystem service by national governments, the recently established cousin of IPCC, EPBS, International Platform for Biodiversity Ecosystem Services. So what I want to say to you, there is a changing in institutional arrangement that have in their mandate these issues very clearly. And then I have global conventions that find economic analysis of ecosystem service helpful. So if somebody is asking us, how can you help them to bring them forward? The assets and benefit sharing by the Convention on Biodiversity, wetland banking by Hampton Convention, priority setting by UNCCD, carbon offset by RED and RED Plus, that I mentioned just a few. So there is a star alignment that we cannot be indifferent and you cannot ignore. And one way to do that is to look the things pragmatically. So I like things very pragmatically. It was the one thing I heritage by spending some time with my colleagues in the Netherlands. And one way of doing that is to look at the GDP, okay? So we understand that the GDP is an important macroeconomic indicator, but for one way or another, the productive base of the economy continues to be eroded. So basically, there's something going wrong with the GDP. So we understand that it's not measuring anything, and all the relationships that are encapsulated in this architecture are not taking into account all assets on the economy. And what can we do to help within that architecture? So we're not reinventing the wheel. We are working with the same architecture information, like a system of national accounts, and how can we bring environment dimension, ecosystem service dimension to it? Take into account that the style alignment in terms of policy and governance is good. This is just sort of a flavor of why to do it. So basically, if you're looking at things and measuring things in a different way or biased way, most probably our decisions may be distorted. And this started in 2010 with the World Bank, the Changing Wealth of the Nations, and some illustrations. And you can see, if we're going from bottom up in the last 10 years, in terms of wealth, the contribution of natural wealth to the total wealth is significant. And is also more significant in terms of the GDP per capita. So among the persons and the countries and economies of low income, this contribution is the highest. Okay? And one way or another, this contribution is not being mapped in the system of national accounts. Okay? Also, in terms, if you go in more detail in some economies and look into agriculture, forest and fisheries, contribution in terms of conventional GDP, for Brazil, Indonesia, and India, we have figures between 6 and 12%. But if you adjust those figures for the contribution of ecosystem service and other market goods, you have substantial differences. So the idea is that you, as a policymaker, if you look into the GDP, most probably you are missing this target, this inner part of the story. And if you take into account the more vulnerable populations in terms of GDP per capita, these things can be even dramatic. the contribution. So what I try to say to you is to understand this contribution of ecosystem service, bring into the surface, so that when you are talking to the policymaker, the policymaker is aware of those trade-offs. And if I make another note, when I talk about the policymaker, with all due respect for the colleagues who sit in the environmental government agencies, the idea is to go beyond that part of the individual. So we need to talk with Minister of Finance, directors of the central banks. We need to talk with the Minister of Development and Urban Planning. So the individuals to whom so far the issue regarding environment is really very weak, if not absent in their agenda. So we need to make the environment, that's my personal opinion, a color which is also present in bureaus and in cabinets over which, or to whom, this dimension, this color was not so frequently used. And most of the times, the Minister of the Environment, this color is very, very well present. In this context, I'll highlight the work we are doing with the World Bank. So the World Bank in 2012 in Rio started this process called WAVES, which is Wealth Account and Evaluation of Ecosystem Services, trust fund over $25 million for 5 years, and that's being renewed. And what was the idea here? The idea was to work with the system of national accounts and introduce in the system of national accounts a methodology to highlight and to measure natural capital. And they tell me, okay, Paulo, but everybody's talking about natural capital for over 30 years. It's almost as old as the system of national accounts. And I say, you're right. But until recently, in 2012, again in Rio, it was not agreed a methodology how to bring that dimension to system of national accounts. And this was only possible with a signature on a system of environmental and economic accounts by UN Statistical Division, New York, where the member states of the United Nations have ratified this methodology. So it's very important for science to have a context where the governance, where the policymakers have an agreement how to proceed. Because if this agreement is not done, most probably your work will have the same reputation. Not reputation, impact, apologize. And this is important, this is a governance issue, because this governance issue will give additional visibility to your work. And this global partnership, in this particular case, with that specified methodology, is using to measure capital to be mainstream in the natural accounts, and then this information will be used for development and planning in the countries. So all the countries are doing this, or starting to do that. There was an agreement on how to proceed. The World Bank is working with 5, with like Madagascar, Costa Rica, Philippines, Botswana, and I forgot one, you apologize for me. And why? Because our countries, they have a lack of technical ability, and also a lack in terms of persons to do the job, but at the same time, their countries are very rich from the natural capital perspective. So the World Bank is just trying to give a help to move things forward. Other countries like the Netherlands, Canada, Norway, and Australia do that on their own. Another thing that shows this mainstreaming of these activities has to do with the work with the UNEP promoted by the GEF. So GEF is a Global Environmental Facility, which is the financial branch of the World Bank Group. So when you talk about the World Bank does not give much money. On the contrary, it goes to your country, asks money to you, so they should change the name. But the GEF indeed gives lots of money, Global Environmental Facility. And here they're working with other countries, and the idea is also to promote this issue of mainstream of ecosystem service in terms of the tools for policy making, and the tools are multidisciplinary, but target at moment 0 to be framed, to be scoped for policy. It gives assistance for policy implementation. So the idea at the end of the day, these results need to be calibrated in a language, in an architecture that the policymakers can read it. And at the same time, both of work is done in a multidisciplinary environment, but also bridging these two worlds, which is the science and the policy. This was just done last week. Was the 2014 is the SEEDS year, UN SEED year, and there was a guidance man on evaluation and account ecosystem service for the SEEDS. And the SEEDS are very important. SEEDS are small island developing states. And the degree of vulnerability and dependence between these small islands and the marine and the ocean systems is very high. So it's a sort of champions to move ahead in this kind of analysis in mainstream ecosystem services. So what I want to say to you, in a nutshell, in a consolidated way, we have the ecosystem services, ecosystem services, and here we have the input from natural scientists in terms of the ecological production functions. You have the second part of the story is how to value those functions, those services, in terms of their impacts with economic activities and human welfare. And then this information is used for decision makers. And again, decision makers are in the process for moment T-1 because everything is shaped around their needs, and therefore you are able to reshape human actions in terms of the ecosystems. This is one part of the story. The second part of the story has to do with the recognition. We need to understand recognition of valuing ecosystem service, and valuing is a feature for all human societies in the economy and communities. In one way or another, you are constantly valuing in your life. When you go to the supermarket, you choose one item over the other. When you choose a house or a school for your child, when you buy a car, when a urban planner decides where to put the green or not to put the green, where to pass a highway or a train, all those things, value is implicit. But at the same time, for ecosystem service, you have to demonstrate the value. So you recognize, but you have also to demonstrate that. And then economists may help you with tools which need to be fine-tuned and adapted to the case study to demonstrate this value. But you're still not happy because at the third and last step, you have to capture this value that you understand it's there, but you have to capture this value in the existing markets. And moreover, you have to mainstream it, okay? And therefore, you are able to introduce mechanisms that incorporate those values in ecosystem service into decision-making, and you are able to make the changes. Okay? So it starts through three consequent and mutually important processes. In this context, the economics of ecosystem service is critical to fulfill these needs. So the idea is it's like a part of your jigsaw that you need to bring into action. And now I just thank you for your time, and let's go for the dolce. So I packed a bit in the beginning, I apologize, but I would like to privilege time for discussion with all of you. Grazie. Toda. If you want to ask some question, now is the moment. If not, it's also the moment. Don't be shy. Yes, please.
Okay, I can ask it this way. Yes. There's two issues which come up usually. One is the difference in locales, because if the example you gave, for example, the evaluation of provisioning services is cardinal in developing countries, which are or resource-based economies, and then the provisioning services are critical. But once you move away from resource-based economies to economies which actually the cultural services are the main ones, then we move into the more difficult valuation issues. And there the question that they asked previously in Hebrew, so I'll say it in English, is usually if we look at the accounting, let's say contingent valuation, which is the kind of things we use, it's usually an undercount. Usually the bottom line, if you read carefully, including the footnote, you see this is an undercount. The result of which in the policy studies, you actually undervalue the cultural services, which are the main issue which comes up, which is a result you actually bias against the protection of the ecosystem services. So there's an issue there. The other part of it is that when we're talking about it and talk about economic valuation, we're talking about the current generation, essentially. It's obvious when you do contingent valuation, but also everything you talk about the current But when we talk about ecosystem services, we have to look about future generations, but we can't ask them and we can't value them. Now, in places, and Israel is a case in point, where we have a lot of development pressures on the very meager open space resources, it means that the economic value of the open spaces or of many of the ecosystems will go up in real terms in the future because they'll become scarcer. But we can't value that. How do you solve these two issues?
I'll be a super person if I could solve them today with you now, but I can give my thoughts on this, and recognizing that something needs to be done to address those things and can be addressed. So the cultural services. So I was born as a no-market econometrician and contingent valuation. So just to put a realm, so the idea is ecosystem services, they give to you, from the conceptual viewpoint, benefits that markets, over which markets can give some idea. So you can value the ecosystem services using markets, existing markets, but some ecosystem services values cannot be captured using existing markets, and you have to compile information. And contingent valuation is one way of doing that. And there's lots of controversy about contingent valuation, how it is to be done, etc., etc. Having said that, what we try to do now with the World Bank is to put that in the freezer, in a sense that this issue needs to be tackled, but we try to have low-hanging fruit and capture the ecosystem services, provisioning and regulating, using existing markets. And why do that? Because if we go, as an economist, I'm equally interested in both. And from societies like for Israel, but also for Italy, and also for the seats, and I'll go into that, cultural services are very important. But since the measurement at the moment is more tricky, we try to give away, to bring the focus of discussion in bringing this ecosystem service into national accounts and not to the metric system. So for the time being, we are not addressing it in this platform. Having said that, we can also use existing markets to capture some of the cultural services, not everything. For example, we did with the World Tourism Organization in Madrid, we look in coastal tourisms in different parts of the world, including Mediterranean, and you have seen like UNESCO sites, like MPA sites, and other parts of the cultural patrimony is a tourism, enhances tourism attractability. And how do we measure that? We measure by the impact that it has in tourism flows, and on average have information about daily expenditures for tourism. So some parts of that iceberg can be tackled, but issues like contingent valuation and no-market valuation will be difficult to coordinate with a system, like the system of national accounts, by definition deals with existing markets. Then you can say, okay, Paul, we could look at satellite accounts. Yes, we can, but it will be difficult to be in the same page, like always something that goes around this constellation. So you have these things there, but not at the same, let's say, page. But I agree with you, it's important. And I also think that contingent valuation needs further refinement, and there was some reflections recently in the Congress of World Economists, now 2 months ago in Istanbul. There is some protocol on how to do these evaluation studies so that we can be more credible. And I'm speaking as a practitioner. Current generation versus future generation. This is an important issue. The reason how people in the future look into the environment and how preferences are of individuals towards the environment. So I don't have children, so I can speak without experience, but the children I see in Italy, these guys freak out with mobile phones and this, and they know this better than me. I don't know exactly in the future, and if you talk about nature, they don't even know what is nature. I mean, I don't know if in the future children will like nature as much as us, or see nature like, oh, nature is an iPhone application. So you need to understand that we need to our actions today cannot jeopardize future actions, but we are assuming that future generations have similar standards of preference for the environments we have. And for that we try to discount. So people say you should discount more, should discount less. What does it mean, discount more or discount less? From the moment you assume that 1 shekel in 1 year time is different from 1 shekel today, you are assuming that the people who have in shekel in 1 year time has less value than us. Okay? Otherwise, the interest rate will be 0. And some institutions use 0 interest rate, so give equal marginal utility of income across generations. But why not negative? Some people may think in the future, just for the sake of discussion, environment is a burden, and they want to live in hyperspace realities, and they put the goggles and they do Star Wars in I don't know, in the Rocky Mountains National Park or Death Valley. I don't know, but it's important to leave the option open, so that the assets are left to them. And we play around the discount rates, which has to do with the profile of the individuals. But we don't know how our children think about the environment. We think that they think somewhere like us. I'm not sure about that, at least what I see in Italy. Yes, please.
What happens when your ecosystem?
Paolo, thank you very much for an excellent talk. What happens when ecosystems have different services to different people and they come into conflict? So following on from your question, you have the cultural benefit of going to the beach, and being on the beach harms the turtle eggs. Or you go to a nature reserve and your trails lead to erosion and the bees then can't pollinate for agriculture. So on the one hand, the land has the benefit of boosting the production of products like food, and the other boosting one's self-worth and enjoyment. There's 2 benefits there, but they may in fact collide.
Thank you. Thank you, Dana, for your question. I mean, this is one of the things where economics should give some information. I'm not saying economics is the solution, but economics should give information. So you have a piece of land, and now we're doing that in Europe with maritime spatial planning, and this zone can be mapped in terms of a matrix of different ecosystem services, and these ecosystem services may accruing to different stakeholders, and some of them are conflicting. Okay, so you cannot have everything of everything. But what is important to understand is the identification of the trade-offs in one hand. So it's like you have a decision support system that you eventually could go in moving one direction and another, and see exactly how the distribution of these benefits is impacting the different stakeholders. And more importantly, when these conflicts occur, which means when Mr. Pink is increasing his welfare by provisioning service, for example, with fisheries, and Mr. Blue can be somebody who has MPA, or just, and this the increasing benefit for provision service is impacting negatively his welfare. According to me, it's important, economics, in addition to identify these trade-offs, is also critical thresholds. For example, natural sciences, and you know better than no one in this room, that the ecosystem functioning has a capacity to deal with impacts until a certain threshold over which the system may flip and may not be stable anymore. Something similar could be done in terms of socioeconomic terms. So we have a sort of trade-offs and impacts in terms of provision of ecosystem service for different scenarios across stakeholders, but each stakeholder will have a threshold over which, if you go beyond, most probably this stakeholder will not be willing to participate and to be compensated or to be in the room with you in discussing any kind of management policy. I think in terms of the identification of those trade-offs and the conflicts, I think this work on economic valuation together with the natural scientists can give an important input. And if I may also, in terms of governance and linking to the panel, this discussion should be open to society in general. Not every Mr. Pink and Mr. Yellow all over the place, but they will have representatives that are brought into the discussion. so that we take into account that what you do is not only in the realm of the natural conservancy areas, which is important, it's like a core, but is also interacting with society in general, and identifying their preference in the different regimes. But thank you for the question. It's fundamental there. Let's, please. One.
May I?
I'm happy that I didn't do the antipast.
Thank you very much for coming in here and for your lecture. It's me. Hi. As an I have two questions. As an environmental economist, when I deliver lectures or for audience from the public service, government, local governments, and so forth, I get the reaction about environmental economists that, well, it's nice and we like what you do and so forth, but it's not accurate and it is subjective. That's one thing. Or the other thing that people say to me, and some people even hear from the audience, I'm with you, but the economists in my office or in the Treasury Department, they say that the environmental economist it doesn't worth anything. What is your reaction about that?
It was like that question I was anticipating, but this is why I'll go back because I don't want to be at all machist or something like that. We could also do with the boy, so everybody will be happy. Complexity is omnipresent. I mean, models by definition are simplifications of reality. The tricky part, in my opinion, so I am one person over 7 billion, no? Is that the work that we do in terms of modeling, either natural scientists, there is a merit per se, and economic science, so there's a merit per se, needs to fit the needs of the policymaker or someone you try to help in terms of allocating of scarce resources, and you know ex ante that the markets are not performing well. So surely you give me gazillions money for research team and gazillions of time, I can always go to the models and do refinements at the margin. I don't think that we should be worried with that in this context. I mean, we should be worried that and be aware and be scientifically honest about the errors. But even GDP, my friend, GDP, if you know how GDP is measured, you say, I mean, I'm not even going shopping anymore. I mean, these people are nuts. But the point is a measure that everybody looks. Merkel looks at it, the guys in the Fed look at it, Draghi in Frankfurt look at it, and definitely people here in Israel look into it. In fact, you have a GDP per capita, almost $40,000 $40,000 per capita, so are super happy from the GDP perspective. But are really super happy? I mean, from the GDP perspective, you should be super happy. But GDP is one part of the story. But to go to you, okay, accuracy is important, but you should not blame yourself that you're not doing the things as good as you like to do. Things need to be published, to be solid, and you should be intellectually honest. But moving on, I mean, people work in scarce information systems, and with scarce information, things can be done.
Thank you. My second question is about GDP. You mentioned now and before in your lecture.
Yeah.
Do you have suggestions for other indicators, complementary indicators?
Complementary indicators, I support it. For other measures, I give the story that the UNEP did. UNEP is doing Inclusive Wealth Report, presented in 2012 in Rio, headed by Sir Partha Gupta, University of Cambridge, a prominent economist. And what he did, his team, is very challenging, is to revise GDP and revise countries' performance taking into account only natural capital. So we're talking about other source of capital. They present this in Rio, and they reevaluate the countries. So you have one kind of listing, a second one. You cannot imagine how UNEP was in a very difficult position with all the countries, so some of the countries, including China, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Australia, where natural resources is an important source of GDP, and their ranking was reevaluated. So you have to also think about the political realm of your story. So as an economist, I think at the margin, let's say, I keep Paaolо Nonnes, the GDP as it is calculated. I respect the architecture, and I try to see in this architecture what is the contribution of ecosystem service in the existing sectors, and what are the trade-offs between those ecosystem service and the other sectors. Just an additional color. If you are Picasso, you put another, or Paul Klee or somebody you like, you bring another brush. But the teller is the same. So that the politicians do not get, I was used to see this painting and bring a new one, so people get uncomfortable. But if you are in a university, it's a very stimulating exercise to do additional. If you go to economics of happiness, the colleagues in Switzerland, ETH in Zurich, they have interesting work about economic of happiness. But unfortunately, or fortunately, happiness is not an indicator to which you make macroeconomic decisions so far. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Thank you.
I'm curious how you would address issues of economic valuation when there's a lack of data. For example, I'm working on a project in the United States right now with the Army Corps of Engineers, and they have a requirement to consider certain things, including a 50-year project time frame and the requirement to consider climate change. So this project is in Florida, and it's a dredging-related project, and they're trying to estimate volumes, and they did not consider the possibility of an extreme storm event. So, for example, with climate change models predicting an increase in both intensity and frequency of storm events, one individual extreme storm event could change the volumes exponentially. And when we bring that to their attention, their answer is that because there is a lack of data, they have no way to estimate these numbers, and therefore they're not considered. And if this kind of an event would happen, it would come out of emergency congressional authorization. So how would you address that type of situation? Thank you.
No, I thank you for I think there are 2 points there, if I may say. There's the issue of data, but there's also the issue that also these are complex issues, and they're not, and science not has it very well covered. So we are even climate change, but we do the best, I think. I don't have a mandate to talk on behalf of scientists, but scientists do the best within the data we have so far. And the information is quite evident, how things are proceeding, and business as usual is, will imply the incurrence of very significantly high welfare costs. So we have to do something, no? So the costs of policy inaction, where inaction is one single word. So the point is, surely, and it fits with the colleague there, where data is abundant, and there is a good and a solid working expertise in the topic, things become somehow clear about the modeling and not much the prediction. I'll prefer to talk about scenarios. You are able to characterize scenarios in more vividly. These issues about extreme events, storms, are also difficult to capture even in systems where data is abundant, because also the involving of the system is being, of the complexity system is being changing rapidly. So my point is that if there is lack of data, what we try to do is trying to do the best with the existing data. For example, in economics, and which is important from other science, we try to transfer value studies from one place to another, take into account some considerations, or use Earth observation systems that are able to characterize land use maps, and you have a matrix of land use maps which gives you some vectors regarding contributions of 1 hectare of that specific ecosystem service with respect to some service, ecosystem with respect to some services, and then this shared as overlap with beneficiaries. Things can be done, but 50 years of, if I understood you well, it's a generous amount of time to be working in one place. I don't think we should just being somehow depressed, or that you don't have all the conditions in your computer, but you try to do the best what you have. 50 years of collecting data, you don't find it so easily across many countries for many issues. So lack of data is important, but you should work and deal with it. And there are ways and how this issue can be addressed and move further. It's funny, I make a comment to myself, because the comments that you do is really on science point. And this is, if I can give a take-home a message when you say, oh, this guy from Italy, or at least try to think science without being in a science group. So if you talk with a policymaker, he is not interested in all these small details. All he is interested is that you are super good in what you're doing, and you have to demonstrate that. You don't put auto-certification. And that, independent of that, you are able to work with him or with them in addressing a well-specific question. And you cannot evoke lack of data or models, or we need to, and just do it. Because if you don't do it, McKinsey will do it, Procter & Gamble will do it, others will do it with two differences. They are much more expensive, and they're much less smarter than you are. It's just the whole point. And you have the opportunity to do this thing in the first place. This is off record, you're not tapping here, okay? So the next one. If not,
Take one more question.
there's a gentleman here. Just point, you are the smartest guys. I mean, you have if there's somebody who can help these complex issues, is you, the community of ecologists and environmental scientists. You cannot do it alone, but if you're in a Shakespeare play, you have an important role. You can be Othello or something like that, or Romeo, and you find the Juliet. Prego.
I want to go back to Professor Rubenstein's question and push you a little harder.
Yes.
Do you think in the trade-off between different ecosystem services, biodiversity enjoys a unique status, either because of option values or because of an ethical thing? When you have a situation where many other ecosystem services are on one side, but they might harm a certain species, do you feel that that is an equal equation, or do you give special status?
On average, I don't give special status to anything unless people attribute a special status. So, if we want all to go Neanderthal, we go Neanderthal. But no Prius, I mean, we're not speaking about Cadillac, no Prius, no electrowaves, no microwaves, no utilities. So to tell to you, biodiversity is important, but it's part of other things that are equally important. So what I try to understand first is to be aware that what you do is impacting biodiversity. So it's not only about sweet talk, but you are able to quantify. And when you impact biodiversity, you are impacting yourself via different ways. Not because the Shannon index goes from delta 1 to delta 2. This is important for science. But because doing delta 1 to delta 2 can be like, say, reduction of pollination services, you are interacting with agricultural productivity, we're interacting with pest disease, you interact with many other things that ultimately are related to you, but are not giving pole position. So if I like pollution, I mean not pollution, but if I am a consumer who interacts a lot in society, and my activities have a negative impact on the environment, it should be respected equally. Gary Becker, a Nobel Prize of Economics, said consumer sovereignty. You should respect the consumer preference wherever they are. And I think I agree with him. What is important is to understand how do we think collectively, and then allocating biodiversity. If you are willing to lose some jobs, if you are losing to relocate your house, your children, if you are using less the car less frequently, the consumption of water less, reduction of consumption of water, reduction of consumption of electricity. Because if you say biodiversity is important per se, I respect your statement, but I will not go with that statement to the Minister of Finance. Unless we are willing to change our behavior collectively so that that priority is reflected in every single action of our lives. And we can do that. In that case, Al Gore, in the small things, the small contribution that we can do every single day can indeed do that. But I'll not give a special role to biodiversity or any kind, because you can always find somebody else who thinks differently for a different indicator. So everyone will has his own ranking. So we have to think it about collectively. I just saw there's a camera there. Please.
So that's it. We're all done for this plenary session. Thank you very much. Please join me for a warm round of applause for Dr. Nunez. And of course, our audience for stimulating questions and the discussion. So thank you for leaving time for discussion. We haven't seen that enough here. We should probably be more respectful of times in the future, so thank you very much.